In today's video, I want to talk about the worst books I read in 2023 that I either DNF'd or gave a very low score. And out of the 45 books that I read in 2023, only 7 are on this list. So let's get started. A quick disclaimer before I actually get into the books. If one of these books is a book that you really enjoy, that doesn't make it a bad book. It just means that I did not connect with these books and I personally did not like them enough to keep on reading them, or I did not like them enough to give them a big score that is 4 or 5 stars. So if you like these books, please don't be offended by this video. It is my personal opinion and you get to enjoy whatever you get to enjoy and I get to enjoy whatever I enjoy. I want to start this video with the books that I DNF'd, and I will start with my most recent DNF, and it is Yumi and the Nightmare Painter by Brandon Sanderson. I had high hopes for this book. This was my first ever Brandon Sanderson book that I picked up and I was so disappointed. I DNF'd this book at 20% in, so I think it was chapter 9, page 70 something. And the main reason that I DNF'd this book is the narrator style. The story itself about Yumi and the Nightmare Painter really intrigued me. I wanted to read this book. I still to this day want to maybe finish this book someday. But the narrator style of this book is what completely threw me off. This was gloating, this was just like pretentious behavior, being like, I'm not gonna explain this too much to you. You wouldn't understand anyways. Like, the narrator was so entitled and so like full of himself that it made me want to throw the book away. So, Yumi and the Nightmare Painter, first book on my list that I really didn't like because of the narrator style and not because of the story. So if for some reason someone decides they want to rewrite this book without the annoying as fuck narrator in it, then I will gladly read it again. And for now, I'm going to hold on to this book because I did still enjoy the main storyline, and maybe one day I will pick it up again, although I'm not really sure I would. And all of the next books I don't own a physical copy of anymore. If I had it, I sold it, and most of these I also read on my e-reader. The next book on my list is The Book Eaters by Sunyi Dean, and the main reason I quit this book is because it was so doom and gloom and horror based instead of like a fantasy world that I enjoyed, that I just felt really depressed by it. Now, do keep in mind, I read this book when I was just diagnosed with depression and burnout, which also didn't help the stakes of this book. However, I really didn't feel any connection to it. I made it 30% in the book. It isn't a super thick book, but I just was like, no. The setting of The Book Eaters by Sunyi Dean is actually a kind of vampire story, and I love vampires. But they had 2 types of vampires. You had the vampire type who like eats books, so the book eaters, and then the other one who eats like minds. And it's the second one that completely threw me off. Also like the setting and the way that everything was, it didn't feel like a fantasy book to me enough to love it, and you will see that in another book as well further down in this list, that if a fantasy book is fantasy, it needs to be like high stakes fantasy. It has to be something that I can't imagine myself happening in the real world, and this book kind of hit too close to home. It just wasn't the vibe that I was looking for, and that's fine. Up next is a book that I had very high hopes for, and it is Babel by R.F. Kuang. This was described to me as like, oh, this is so good, it's the arcane history of Babel, of the Tower of Babel, and I know my history, and I know as a kid, whenever I was learning about it, that I was super intrigued by this tower. Whenever I started reading this book, I was bored out of my mind with it. I made it 10% into the book, and if you know what type of chunk of book it is, it's also a lot of pages that I already read, and I just, nope. Absolutely, like, I felt so bored by the main character. They had no personality. The only thing that was happening was that this mentor type person was forcing them to read and to get smarter and to learn new languages. I just, nope, not a book for me, not fantasy whatsoever. I know it's probably like a historic fiction, blah, blah, blah. Not for me. I prefer like high fantasy stakes. Up next, we have a book that I wish I did love. It is Robin Hobb's second book in the Farseer trilogy. The first one was The Assassin's Apprentice, and the second one is called Royal Assassin. And Assassin's Apprentice I read entirely, loved it. It's kind of a coming-of-age story with the main character Fitz, and in the second book we continue on that. But in the second book it gets annoying. It feels like Fitz is sent from here to there without any actual purpose except of killing the zombie-like creatures that are attacking the country, basically. It feels very empty, it feels like a filler. I made it through 40% of the book apparently before I decided to completely ditch it. I did read the third book, or I listened to it with my partner in the car. My partner listens to audiobooks, whereas I prefer reading, so I do know how book 3 ended, and it made me give it some closure. I never added it to my Goodreads read list because I didn't actually read the book, but I still know how the story continues, and I felt like book 2 had middle book syndrome, wasn't necessary at all, and yeah, again, I was just bored out of my mind with it. And then finally, we have 3 books that I actually fully read. The first one is The Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires by Grady Hendrix. This book was marketed as oh, it's super funny, it's like a Buffy take in a book, and yeah, it's a book club and they decide to kill a vampire, blah blah blah. It was marketed as something with more humor in it, something that would have fun setting, etc. However, this turned out to be a housewife horror novel, and at the level of a housewife that would have written it. I read this book on holiday, and it was back when whenever I wanted to read a book, I would read the entire book. I only started DNFing books later on in the year because at first I would feel guilty if I DNF'd a book, and I was like, oh, if so many people like it, I must read it entirely, it will get better. It did not get better. So we follow this very boring, stuck-up housewife. She's trying to break out of that typical role of being a housewife, but her environment doesn't let her. It's like, you can clearly tell that this book was written by a man as well. If you like degrading things about women, not specifically like they can't do anything, but more like they're not worthy of doing more things. It's a very housewife setting in the USA in the 50s, 60s. That's, I think, also the setting of the book. There were a few horror aspects of the book. They didn't improve anything around the book. It was just plain weird. There wasn't really explanations given to a lot of the things. And then all of a sudden a vampire character comes into the story. It's very a cruel type of story as well. There's a lot of manipulation happening. There's a lot of gore. In the end, they decide to kill it, but the main character really has to push forward and give them proof and everything. And no. I gave this to a friend of mine who likes horror stories. I'm not even sure if she read it yet. I just wanted that book out of my house as fast as possible. I will never recommend this book to anyone unless you really know what you're getting into. But yeah, I was just really disappointed, and mainly because of the false marketing of the book. And the same thing goes for the final 2 books on this list, Haunting Adeline and Hunting Adeline. This book was everywhere on TikTok whenever I was first getting into more fantasy romances, enemies to lovers, etc. This was marketed as a little bit of a stalker romance. Oh yeah, but the spice is so good and yada yada yada. This book was terrible. The only reason I read the 2 books is because the cliffhanger on book 1 left me wondering and panicking on oh no, what happens in book 2? So I only read book 2 for closure. There is sex trafficking, there is human trafficking, there is very explicit non-consensual scenes in this. And from a certain standpoint, I would get it. The first book was still kind of okay. We have this writer, so the main character we follow, Adeline, is a writer and she gets stalked. The setup is that she lives in a big house that she inherited from her grandparents, and she discovers books from her great-grandma, I think, who was found dead at one point. So she finds her diaries at some point in the book, and we think it's going to be a murder investigation, which honestly would have made the book even better. The first book was trash, the second book was worse. The first book had a lot of good starting points, but went nowhere. It just fell flat to me. And other than the stalker and the girl getting more intimate and getting to know each other, and no, don't pick up these books. Don't give it more hype than it already has, because it doesn't really deserve it, in my personal opinion. Again, because of the marketing gone wrong. This is not a stalker romance book. This is just a creepy stalker book, in my opinion. Is the romance good? Nah, not really. Are some of the scenes good? Yes. Do I think that this book had potential of going somewhere completely different, especially the second book? Yes. Was it good? No. And if you're still like, oh, I want to know what the hype is about, read the trigger warnings first. If you are put off by the trigger warnings, don't start reading this book. I read this book at a moment that I was very detached from a lot of things, so I couldn't really connect with a lot of the books that I was reading, and that's when I read this one, and I was like, it was as if I was hovering above it and reading it, but not really like registering what I was reading in the way that it's like written and described. Some of the scenes that are described are just plain cruel. Yeah. And this is honestly not a book that I would ever have on my bookshelf. I sold the physical copy of book 2 because book 1 I could find an EPUB version of, the second one I couldn't because of all of the restrictions on it, and I totally get it. So I spent way too much money on getting the second book, reading it. I sold it immediately after I read it. I would never have this on my bookshelf. I would never keep this book, and I would never recommend this to anyone because it's just a big old nope for me. So these were the 7 books that I DNF'd or gave a very low rating in 2023. Again, if you did enjoy these books, don't take this personally. It's not an attack against you loving these books. It's just that for me, these books didn't work, and that's why I'm making this video, so you know what books you can and cannot expect on my channel. There will for sure not be a lot of Brandon Sanderson, and there definitely will not be any HD Carlton books anymore on my channel. Feel free to let me know in the comments down below, did you read any of these books? Did you enjoy them, or like me, did you not enjoy them? And of course, if there's other books that you read during 2023 that you really did not enjoy, feel free to let me know which book and also why you didn't enjoy it in the comments down below. Feel free to give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, and of course don't forget to subscribe to my channel if you want to see more videos by me. I make new videos every week and I would love to have you for every single one of them. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you very soon with the next video. Bye!